The morning of May 17th, 1858, dawned with such perfection that the servants of Fairfax House whispered it was a blessing from heaven itself upon Lady Beatrice Fairfax and her forthcoming marriage to Sebastian Whitmore, the Duke of Ashford. The sky stretched cloudless and blue over London, and by noon, when the wedding was to commence, sunlight poured through the ancient stained glass windows of Westminster Abbey in rivers of crimson, sapphire, and gold, painting the stone floors with pools of celestial colour that seemed to dance as the assembled guests shifted in their pews. 400 souls had gathered within those hallowed walls, representing the pinnacle of English society, peers of the realm in their formal mourning dress, political luminaries whose decisions shaped the nation, distant cousins of the royal family itself, and countless others whose presence testified to the significance of this union between two of England's oldest families. The air hung heavy with the perfume of thousands of white roses and lilies, their blooms cascading from every column and archway, transforming the ancient abbey into a garden of impossible luxury. The altar itself stood draped in white silk, embroidered with gold thread, the fabric so fine it seemed to shimmer in the filtered light, and before it waited the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, prayer book in hand, prepared to sanctify a betrothal that had been arranged before either party could walk or speak. Lady Beatrice Fairfax stood at that altar in a gown that had required 6 months of labour by London's finest seamstresses, ivory silk imported from France, and Belgian lace so delicate it appeared woven from morning mist, her chestnut hair arranged beneath a veil of Honiton lace that had belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother before her. At 28 years of age, Beatrice knew she was older than most brides, knew that society had long whispered about her unmarried state, even as they acknowledged the binding nature of her childhood betrothal, knew that this day represented not just a wedding, but a vindication of the patience she had maintained through the years of waiting for Sebastian Whitmore to deem himself ready for marriage. Her bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms trembled slightly in her gloved hands, the only outward sign of the nervousness that coiled in her stomach, though whether that nervousness stemmed from anticipation or some deeper foreboding she could not have said. Beside her stood her mother, Lady Henrietta Fairfax, resplendent in lavender silk, whose anxious eyes kept darting toward the Duke as though expecting some disaster even in this moment of triumph. In the front pew sat Captain Thomas Whitmore, the Duke's younger brother, his military uniform crisp and correct, though his face bore an expression of such misery that several guests had remarked upon it in whispers. The Gothic arches of Westminster soared overhead, creating simultaneously a sense of grandeur and claustrophobia, as though the weight of centuries pressed down upon all gathered there, and the magnificent acoustics meant that every whisper, every rustle of silk, every cleared throat echoed through the space with unnatural clarity. Outside the abbey, carriages lined the streets for blocks, their drivers waiting with the patience born of long service, while crowds of common Londoners pressed against the barriers erected by constables, hoping for a glimpse of what the newspapers had proclaimed the wedding of the season, the marriage that would unite the Fairfax fortune with the Ashford title in an alliance both families had anticipated for nearly 3 decades. Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, stood at the altar in formal black mourning dress that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair swept back from features that poets had compared to classical marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, his grey eyes fixed not on his bride but on some point in the middle distance, his jaw tight with attention that Beatrice had noticed the moment she reached his side. He was 32 years old, had inherited his title at the age of 26 upon his father's death, and had spent the 6 years since managing the vast Ashford estates with a precision and dedication that won him respect even from those who found his manner cold. Beatrice had known him all her life, had been bound to him by contract since before either could remember, yet in many ways he remained a stranger, their interactions always formal, always chaperoned, always constrained by the expectations of their respective positions. She had told herself that affection would grow after marriage, that the years ahead would allow them to discover each other beyond the masks of duty they both wore, had even allowed herself to imagine that perhaps something deeper might bloom between them. Now, standing beside him as the Archbishop prepared to begin the ceremony, she felt the coldness radiating from him like a physical force, and wondered if she had been fooling herself all along. The assembled guests had finally settled into expectant silence, fans stilled, whispers quieted, all eyes fixed upon the tableau at the altar, when Sebastian moved with sudden decisive purpose that shattered the moment's sanctity. From within his coat he withdrew a rolled parchment, the betrothal contract that had been signed by their fathers 26 years earlier, the document that had governed both their lives since infancy, and held it aloft where all could see, his hand steady as stone, despite the magnitude of what was about to occur. The Archbishop's eyes widened in confusion. Lady Henrietta gasped audibly, and Beatrice felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs in a rhythm of pure dread as Sebastian's fingers found the edge of that precious parchment and began to tear. The sound of ripping paper echoed through Westminster Abbey like a thunderclap, each methodical tear, precise and deliberate, Sebastian's face betraying no emotion as he reduced the contract to strips and let them fall like snow upon the white silk that draped the altar. 400 people sat frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing, as the Duke of Ashford destroyed the legal foundation of the marriage that was to have taken place. Beatrice could not move, could not breathe, could only watch as her entire future disintegrated before her eyes, her fingers tightening on her bouquet until the thorns of the roses pierced through her gloves and drew blood that spotted the white silk like accusatory crimson tears. When the last piece of parchment had fallen, Sebastian finally turned to face her, though his eyes still refused to meet hers, sliding instead to a point just past her shoulder, and his voice when he spoke carried through the vaulted space with the aristocratic precision of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I cannot in good conscience bind myself to a woman whose affections are directed elsewhere," he declared, each word falling like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the congregation. "This betrothal, arranged since our childhoods, was built on a foundation I believed to be mutual respect, and perhaps in time affection. I have discovered I was mistaken." The words seemed to come from very far away to Beatrice, who felt as though she were drowning, sinking beneath dark water while the world above continued without her. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely audible even in that space designed to carry sound. "If you would permit me to explain." Sebastian cut her off with a gesture, still refusing to look directly at her, his profile sharp as a blade against the colored light streaming through the windows behind them. "The evidence speaks plainly enough, Lady Beatrice," he said, and she could hear something beneath the cold control of his voice, some tremor of emotion he was fighting to suppress. "I release you from all obligations. May you find happiness where your heart truly lies." Then he turned on his heel with military precision and began to walk down the long aisle toward the abbey doors, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence, 400 pairs of eyes tracking his progress in disbelief. The spell broke as he reached the midpoint of the aisle, and suddenly the abbey erupted in chaos, voices rising in a cacophony of shock and speculation and barely concealed delight at such unprecedented scandal. Lady Henrietta swayed, and would have fallen had not the Countess of Pembroke caught her, though even as that lady supported her, she was whispering urgently to her daughter about the disaster unfolding before them. Captain Thomas Whitmore had risen from his pew, his face stricken with an expression of guilt and horror that would have told a careful observer everything they needed to know about his role in this catastrophe, but no one was watching Thomas. The Archbishop fumbled with his prayer book, dropping it entirely, the thud of its impact on the stone floor punctuating the moment. Whispers raced through the congregation like wildfire, fragments of speculation and gossip that would within hours spread through every drawing-room in London. "The Whitmore scandal continues," someone hissed, and another voice replied, "First his father's gambling debts, now this." "Poor Lady Beatrice," murmured a third voice with the particular satisfaction of those who delight in others' misfortunes, jilted at Westminster itself. Beatrice stood motionless at the altar, her world collapsing around her, while the physical world remained stubbornly intact, the flowers still blooming, the light still streaming through ancient glass, her heart still beating though she wished desperately that it would stop. Blood from the rose thorns had begun to seep through her gloves in earnest now, small red flowers blooming on white silk, and somewhere in the chaos of her mind she thought how appropriate it was that her wedding day should involve her own blood. She would not cry, she told herself fiercely, would not give these 400 witnesses the satisfaction of seeing her break, would not collapse as her mother had done. Instead, she lifted her chin with the same defiant dignity that had sustained her through 28 years of society's subtle cruelties and less subtle dismissals, and stood tall as a queen before her executioners. Sebastian had reached the Abbey doors now, had passed through them into the London sunlight without a backward glance, leaving behind him a bride abandoned at the altar and a scandal that would echo through society for years to come. The crowd outside erupted in confused noise as the Duke appeared alone, climbing into his waiting carriage and departing at speed, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones in their haste. Inside Westminster Abbey, Beatrice Fairfax remained standing at the altar in her wedding gown, surrounded by the ruins of her reputation and the ghost of her future, her bouquet of white roses staining her gloves with blood, while 400 witnesses whispered and stared and committed every detail to memory so they might share this delicious scandal over tea for months to come. The scent of lilies had become cloying, suffocating, and the pools of coloured light on the floor seemed to mock her with their beauty. This was how it ended, then, she thought with a strange detachment born of shock. Not with vows and joy and the beginning of a new life, but with torn parchment and public humiliation and the certain knowledge that she would from this moment forward be defined by this disaster, would be forever the woman rejected by the Duke of Ashford at Westminster Abbey itself, the bride who was not good enough, whose affections had been elsewhere though she herself had not known it. The Archbishop approached her hesitantly, clearly uncertain what protocol governed such an unprecedented situation. But Beatrice did not wait for his counsel. She turned from the altar with her head held high, placed the bloodied bouquet carefully on the white silk draping where moments before her betrothal contract had been destroyed, and began the long walk back down the aisle she had so recently traversed in hope. The crowd parted before her as though she carried plague, and she could feel their eyes upon her like physical weights, could hear the whispers following in her wake, could sense the mixture of pity and gleeful scandal that her ruin had inspired. But she did not falter, did not stumble, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, and when she finally emerged into the London sunlight, she climbed into her carriage with the same dignity she had brought to the altar, and only when the door had closed and the carriage had begun to move did she finally allow herself to close her eyes against the tears that would no longer be contained. 3 days after the disaster at Westminster Abbey, Fairfax House had taken on the atmosphere of a tomb, its windows shuttered against the curious stares of passers-by who slowed their carriages hoping for a glimpse of the ruined bride, its doors firmly closed against the flood of visitors who called ostensibly to offer sympathy but truly to satisfy their appetite for scandal. Lady Beatrice Fairfax had not left her rooms since returning from the Abbey, had refused all callers with a firmness that bordered on rudeness, and had taken to wearing black as though mourning a death, which in a sense she was, the death of her future, her reputation, and whatever foolish hope she had harboured that Sebastian Whitmore might have cared for her beyond the obligations of their arranged betrothal. The morning room where she now sat had once been her favourite space in the house, its tall windows facing the garden, its walls papered in a cheerful yellow that caught the morning light. But now the curtains were drawn halfway, as though the room itself could not bear to face the world fully, and the trunks containing her wedding trousseau stood in the corner like silent accusers, packed with gowns and linens she would never use, a future that would never unfold. Rain had begun that morning, a light pattering against the windows that matched the grey desolation of her mood, and somewhere in the house servants whispered in hallways, their voices carrying just enough for her to know she was being discussed, but not enough to discern the words. On a side table near her chair sat a silver tray piled with unopened letters, expressions of sympathy from acquaintances she could not bear to face, and beside them lay a newspaper whose headline she could see even from across the room in bold, merciless print. Westminster wedding becomes Westminster scandal. A clock on the mantel ticked with aggressive loudness in the silence, each second a small eternity, and Beatrice sat in a straight-backed chair with the rigid posture of one who dared not relax lest she shatter entirely. Her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in an expression of cold dignity that concealed the chaos within. Her mother, Lady Henrietta Fairfax, hovered anxiously in the doorway, having recovered from her faint at the Abbey, but not from the social catastrophe that had befallen their family, torn between the dictates of propriety and a mother's desperate hope that somehow this nightmare might still be salvaged. The household had fallen into an uneasy routine of grief and whispered speculation when, on the afternoon of the third day, that routine was shattered by the arrival of Captain Thomas Whitmore, who appeared at the front door demanding to see Lady Beatrice with an urgency that bordered on violence. The butler, trained in the art of polite refusal, informed the captain that Lady Beatrice was not receiving visitors, to which Thomas replied that he was not a visitor, but the cause of her ruin, and would not be turned away, his voice rising loud enough that Beatrice heard it from her morning-room sanctuary. She sent word through her maid that she would not see him, could not bear to see anyone connected to the Whitmore family, could not face the brother of the man who had destroyed her so publicly and completely. But Thomas refused to leave, took up a position in the entrance hall, and declared he would remain there until she granted him audience. Propriety be damned. For nearly an hour he waited while Beatrice wrestled with her decision, part of her wanting to hear what explanation he might offer, part of her wanting nothing more than to maintain her isolation from a world that had proven so cruel. But finally, curiosity and a spark of her old spirit won out, and she sent word that she would see him for 10 minutes and no more. Thomas entered the morning room like a man facing execution, his usually immaculate military bearing replaced by an agitation that expressed itself in every jerky movement, and the moment the door closed behind him, he began to pace the room with frenetic energy, running his hands through his dark hair repeatedly until it stood in wild disarray. Beatrice remained seated, her posture unchanged, watching him with eyes that had gone cold as winter stone, and did not offer him the courtesy of greeting or invitation to sit. Lady Henrietta positioned herself just outside the door, leaving it slightly ajar in a nod to propriety, while clearly intending to listen to every word spoken, her presence a reminder that even in ruin, certain forms must be maintained. Thomas stopped his pacing abruptly and turned to face Beatrice, his young face ravaged by guilt and sleeplessness, and began to speak in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in his haste to explain. "Beatrice, you must understand I showed Sebastian the letters to prove your innocence," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine even through her numbness. "They were about Wordsworth and Coleridge, nothing more, discussions of poetry and philosophy after father died, and I was lost, and you were kind enough to help me make sense of the romantic poets who seemed to speak to my grief. But Georgiana had already poisoned his mind, had told him I confessed to loving you, which I never did. I mean, I hold you in the highest regard, but as a brother would, as family." The words came faster now, as though he feared if he stopped, he would never find the courage to continue. She took the letters from my rooms. Beatrice, our cousin Georgiana, who has always loved Sebastian, though he never saw her as anything but family. She saw your letters to me and realized they could be twisted if one wanted to see impropriety where there was none. Beatrice listened with a stillness that was more frightening than any outburst, her face betraying nothing of the horror and fury building within her as the truth of her destruction began to emerge, piece by careful piece. "So my reputation lies in ruins because you would die for me," she said finally, her voice like ice cutting through his frantic explanations. "How very noble, Thomas!" He flinched as though she had struck him, but pressed on, dropping to his knees before her chair in a gesture of supplication that would have been theatrical had his distress not been so evident. "I went to him to defend you," he insisted, his hands gripping the arms of her chair. "I told him the letters were perfectly innocent, that you were helping me understand poetry after Father's death left me adrift and uncertain. But Sebastian's grief has made him suspicious of everyone, has turned him into someone I barely recognize, hard and cold, and seeing betrayal in every shadow." The captain's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued. "He said to me, 'A man does not seek comfort from his brother's intended, unless his intentions are less than honorable.' And I tried to explain that it was not comfort I sought, but education, that you were merely being kind to a grieving fool, but he would not hear it." "And you let him believe it?" Beatrice asked, her words precise and cutting. Thomas's face crumpled with shame, and he shook his head violently. "I tried to explain, but then I lost my temper, which I should not have done. Said something foolish about him not deserving you if he could not see your virtue plainly, if he could trust the manipulations of Georgiana over your character. He took it as confirmation, Beatrice, saw my defense of you as proof that my feelings were what she had claimed them to be. I told him I would die for you, and meant it as a brother would mean it, as anyone who knows your goodness would mean it. But in his grief and suspicion he heard it as a declaration of romantic love." The rain against the windows had intensified, creating a steady drumbeat that underscored the revelation unfolding in the morning room, and somewhere in the house a door closed with a sound like a gunshot. Beatrice sat motionless, processing the information, feeling vindication war with despair in her chest. For yes, she was innocent. Yes, she had been manipulated. Yes, this entire catastrophe was built on lies and misunderstanding. But none of that changed the essential truth that Sebastian had not trusted her enough to ask her directly, had chosen to believe the worst without granting her the courtesy of explanation or defense. "Georgiana Dashwood," she said slowly, testing the name on her tongue like poison. "Our cousin Georgiana, who used to follow Sebastian about at family gatherings like a devoted puppy, who would arrange to sit beside him at dinner, who looked at him as though he hung the moon and stars." Thomas nodded miserably. She had access to my rooms as family, knew where I kept correspondence, and selected the letters that could be read with suspicion, if one was inclined to suspicion. Your discussions of passion in Wordsworth, of the nature of love in Coleridge's verse, of the soul's longing for connection, all innocent in context, but damning when removed from it and presented to a man already wounded and wary. "And she has been visiting Sebastian at Ashford Manor," Beatrice said. "Not a question but a statement, pieces falling into terrible place." Thomas's expression confirmed it before his words did. "Daily," he admitted, offering comfort in his time of trial, as she puts it, positioning herself as the understanding friend while you are cast as the betrayer. The solicitor Sebastian sent to arrange the separation of properties mentioned it, said Lady Georgiana has been most attentive to his Grace's well-being. Beatrice felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, rage pure and clarifying after 3 days of grief and confusion. She stood abruptly, forcing Thomas to scramble backward, and crossed to the window where she stared out at the rain-soaked garden without seeing it. "So I am ruined," she said quietly, Because your cousin is a manipulative schemer, and your brother is too consumed by grief and pride to seek the truth before destroying an innocent woman. Thomas rose from his knees, his face anguished. I am leaving for India with my regiment, he said abruptly. I cannot remain here knowing what my foolish words and Georgiana's scheming have cost you. I thought I was defending you, Beatrice, but I have only made things worse, and I cannot bear to see the wreckage I have helped create. How convenient for you, Beatrice replied, without turning from the window, her voice devoid of the warmth she had once shown him. You may flee to India and adventure, while I remain here to live with the consequences of your noble defense. Thomas made a sound like a wounded animal, but did not dispute her words. I am sorry, he whispered, inadequate and true. I am so desperately sorry, Beatrice. You should be, she said, finally turning to face him, and saw that tears tracked down his young face, genuine remorse that did nothing to repair the damage done. When do you leave for India? Within the fortnight, he replied. I requested an immediate posting, could not stay here another moment knowing what I had done. Then go, she said with finality, and try in future to think before you speak, particularly when defending ladies who require no defense because they have done nothing wrong. Thomas moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Sebastian is suffering too, he said quietly. He has shut himself away at Ashford Manor, will see no one save Georgiana, who he still believes is merely being kind. He thinks he acted honorably, Beatrice, thinks he saved you from a loveless marriage to a man who could not love you properly when your heart belonged elsewhere. He is wrong, she said flatly, but that wrongness has already destroyed me, so his suffering is of little consequence. After Thomas left, escorted out by a butler whose disapproval was evident in every rigid line of his posture, Beatrice remained standing at the window, watching rain fall on the garden where she had once walked, and imagined a future that now would never come to pass. Lady Henrietta entered the room tentatively, her face alight with desperate hope. "Did you hear?" she asked. "It was all a misunderstanding. Manipulation by that dreadful Dashwood girl. Surely this can be salvaged. Surely if Sebastian knows the truth, he will." "Will what, mother?" Beatrice interrupted, her voice sharp. "Will apologize for humiliating me before 400 witnesses, will restore my reputation with a word, will erase the scandal that now defines me. Even if he learned the truth today and came on bended knee to beg forgiveness, the damage is done. I am ruined whether the ruin was just or not." "But you are innocent," Lady Henrietta protested. "The letters were innocent. Georgiana manipulated the situation. Thomas's words were misconstrued." "None of that matters," Beatrice said tiredly, suddenly feeling every one of her 28 years and 100 more besides. "What matters is what society believes, and society believes I was conducting an inappropriate correspondence with my betrothed's brother. The truth is irrelevant, mother. Reputation is all." She moved away from the window and sank back into her chair, the brief surge of clarifying rage fading back into numbness. The wedding trousseau in the corner seemed to mock her with its pristine, unused contents, gowns for a life that would never be lived, and the clock on the mantel continued its relentless ticking, counting out seconds that led nowhere but further into isolation and ruin. Outside, the rain fell harder now, and somewhere across London at his country estate, Sebastian Whitmore sat in ignorance of the truth, believing himself honourable and Beatrice false, while Georgiana Dashwood no doubt poured poison into his ears with every sympathetic visit, positioning herself as the woman who might heal his wounded heart. Beatrice closed her eyes against the injustice of it all, against the knowledge that she had been made a pawn in someone else's game, against the reality that Sebastian had chosen to believe the worst of her without even granting her the courtesy of a question, and felt something inside her that had remained stubbornly hopeful these 3 days finally break and die. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. 1 week after the disaster at Westminster Abbey, Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, sat alone in the study of Ashford Manor, surrounded by the trappings of his inherited position and feeling the weight of his title as a physical burden that pressed down upon his shoulders with suffocating force. The study was a dark, panelled room that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him, its walls hung with portraits of stern Whitmore ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movements with expressions of judgment and disappointment, and everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of the legacy he had inherited along with the dukedom, the debts his father had left behind, the responsibilities that consumed his days, the expectations that had shaped his entire existence. His father's massive oak desk still bore the evidence of financial chaos Sebastian had been working to resolve, unpaid bills and overdue accounts that spoke to years of mismanagement and excess, gambling losses and poor investments that had brought the once great Ashford estate to the brink of ruin. Rain had begun that afternoon, a spring storm that lashed the manor windows with increasing violence as evening fell, and candles guttered in the draughts that found their way through even this solidly built house, creating shadows that danced across the ancestral portraits like accusing fingers. Sebastian had retreated to Ashford Manor immediately after the scene at Westminster, had sent his solicitor to London to handle the necessary legal separations, while he himself remained in this self-imposed exile, unable to face society or even his own household staff, whose carefully neutral expressions could not quite hide their shock at what their master had done. He had convinced himself he acted with honor, had told himself repeatedly through the long days since Westminster that he had saved both himself and Beatrice from a marriage built onto false foundations, that discovering her betrayal before the vows were spoken was a mercy however painful, that walking away had been the difficult but necessary choice of a man who valued integrity above all else. Yet something in that conviction had begun to crack, small fissures appearing in his certainty as he replayed the scene at the Abbey over and over in his mind, remembering Beatrice's face as he tore the betrothal contract, the way her skin had gone pale as death, the blood from the rose thorns staining her white gloves, the dignity with which she had stood before 400 witnesses to her humiliation. He had not looked at her directly, had not been able to meet her eyes, and he told himself it was because seeing her pain would weaken his resolve. But in the dark hours of sleepless nights, he began to wonder if it was because some part of him knew even then that he was making a terrible mistake. Lady Georgiana Dashwood had been a frequent visitor to Ashford Manor since the wedding disaster, appearing daily with expressions of sympathy and understanding, assuring Sebastian that he had acted correctly if painfully, that a man of his position could not afford to be made a fool by an unfaithful woman, that in time he would see this as a fortunate escape from a marriage that would have brought him only misery. Her visits should have been a comfort, but instead left him feeling hollow and uneasy in ways he could not name, and when she spoke of Beatrice with thinly veiled contempt, suggesting that perhaps the lady had been conducting not one but multiple inappropriate correspondences, something in Sebastian recoiled, even as he told himself Georgiana was only trying to help him accept the painful truth. It was in this state of growing unease and doubt that Lady Clara Wentworth arrived at Ashford Manor on the evening of the 7th day after Westminster, sweeping into the study without waiting to be announced in the way of elderly relatives who have earned the privilege of dispensing with formality. Lady Clara was Sebastian's great-aunt, his mother's aunt, in fact, a woman of 70 years who had helped raise him after his mother's death when he was barely 10 years old, and she was the only person in his life who had never treated him with the deference due a duke, but rather with the sharp honesty due a boy she had known since infancy. She took one look at Sebastian sitting behind his father's desk, surrounded by unpaid bills and portraits of disapproving ancestors, and her expression hardened into something between pity and fury. "You inherited your father's title." "Sebastian," she said without preamble, her voice cutting through the study like a blade, "but I prayed you had not inherited his rashness to judgment." It seems my prayers went unanswered. Sebastian rose from his chair, startled by both her arrival and the anger in her tone. "Aunt Clara." "I did not expect you," he began, but she waved away his words with an impatient gesture and crossed to stand before the desk, drawing from her reticule a folded letter that she placed on the surface with the care one might use when handling something poisonous. "Read this," she commanded, "and then you will listen to what I have come to tell you, and God help you, Sebastian, for what you have done." He picked up the letter with hands that had begun to tremble, though he could not have said why, unfolded it with growing dread, and began to read the elegant feminine script that filled the page. It was a letter from Georgiana Dashwood to a friend, dated 3 days before the wedding, and as Sebastian read its contents, the study seemed to tilt around him, the portraits on the walls blurring, his breath coming short and painful in his chest. The little fool actually believes those insipid letters to Thomas are what convinced him, Georgiana had written with obvious satisfaction. Sebastian sees betrayal everywhere since his father's death, has become suspicious and withdrawn, and it required only the smallest push to turn that suspicion toward his precious Beatrice. I merely suggested to him that a woman who writes so passionately about love and longing to another man might not have her heart entirely committed to her betrothed, and his wounded pride did the rest. Thomas's dramatic declaration that he would die for her was a gift I could not have anticipated, but used most effectively. Soon enough, Sebastian will realize he needs someone who understands him, who has been faithful when others were false, and he will turn to me as he should have done years ago before his father trapped him in that ridiculous betrothal to settle gambling debts. By summer I expect to be the Duchess of Ashford, and Beatrice Fairfax will be nothing but an unfortunate memory of a scandal narrowly avoided. The letter fell from Sebastian's shaking hands onto the desk, and he stood frozen, unable to move or speak or breathe, the world contracting to a single point of horrific understanding. "Your father bound you to Beatrice Fairfax not out of wisdom or affection between families," Lady Clara said into the terrible silence, "but because he lost £40,000 to Lord Fairfax at cards and had not the means to pay. The betrothal was the settlement. Did you know that, Sebastian?" "No," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "He told me it was a strategic alliance between our families, a joining of the Ashford title with the Fairfax fortune that would benefit both houses." Lady Clara's expression was pitiless. "Your father was many things, but honest was rarely among them," she replied. "He gambled away much of the estate you have been working so hard to restore these past 6 years, made promises he could not keep, created obligations that became your burden when he died." The betrothal to Beatrice was one such obligation, a contract signed to satisfy a debt of honor when he had no money to satisfy it with coin. And knowing this, knowing that even your betrothal was tainted by his weakness, you have now proven yourself his son in the worst possible way, condemning an innocent woman without evidence, acting on wounded pride rather than reason, seeing betrayal where there was none, because you have learned from him to trust no one. The words struck Sebastian like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and he felt his carefully constructed justifications crumbling away, leaving only the raw truth of what he had done. He had destroyed Beatrice Fairfax, had humiliated her before all of London, had torn their betrothal contract to pieces and walked away from her at the altar, and it had all been based on lies, on manipulation, on the poisoned suggestions of a woman who wanted what Beatrice had, and on his own failure to simply ask, to grant the woman he was to marry the basic courtesy of hearing her side before condemning her. God, Sebastian whispered, sinking back into his chair. What have I done? What have I done? Lady Clara watched him with eyes that held both sympathy and stern judgment. You have acted rashly and cruelly, she said, and you have destroyed not only Beatrice's reputation, but any possibility of happiness for either of you, built as it might have been on the flawed foundation your father created. The question now, Sebastian, is what you intend to do about it. He looked up at her, his face ravaged with the realization of his catastrophic error. How did you come by this letter? He asked. Georgiana's maid, Lady Clara replied. A loyal girl who was troubled by what she saw her mistress doing and brought the letter to me, knowing I would ensure it reached the right hands. Georgiana does not yet know her scheming has been exposed, but she will soon enough when you confront her. I cannot, Sebastian said, rising abruptly from his chair and moving to the window where rain now lashed the glass with such force it seemed the storm meant to break through. I cannot face her, cannot face anyone, cannot. He stopped, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, and felt his stomach revolt against the knowledge of what he had done, turned away from the window, and was sick into the wastebasket beside his desk, his body rejecting the poison of his actions as violently as his mind was rejecting the man he had become. Lady Clara waited without comment until he had composed himself, then spoke with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized all her words. Being sick will not undo what you have done, she said. Hiding here at Ashford Manor will not repair the damage. You must go to her, Sebastian, must tell her the truth, must beg her forgiveness, though you have no right to expect it. But her reputation, he began, and Lady Clara cut him off with a sharp gesture. Is already destroyed by your actions at Westminster? She finished. Nothing you do now will make that worse, but failing to acknowledge your error, failing to publicly admit that you wronged her, that will make it infinitely worse for you both. Go to her. Tell her you were wrong. Accept whatever judgment she renders. It is the least you owe her after what you have done. Sebastian stood motionless for a long moment, the enormity of his task overwhelming him. Then something shifted in his expression, the paralysis of horror giving way to desperate purpose. He strode from the study, shouting for his horse to be saddled immediately, ignoring the startled servants who scrambled to obey, and within minutes he was riding out from Ashford Manor into the building storm, his face set with grim determination as rain soaked through his coat and the darkness closed around him. The ride to London was a nightmare of mud and rain and treacherous footing, the storm that had been building all day now unleashed in full fury. But Sebastian drove his horse forward with reckless urgency, heedless of the danger, thinking only of Beatrice and the terrible wrong he had done her, the innocent woman he had destroyed based on lies and his own poisoned suspicions. He reached London near midnight, the streets transformed into rivers by the torrential rain, gas lamps creating halos of light in the downpour that did little to illuminate the way, and rode directly to Grosvenor Square, where Fairfax House stood dark and shuttered against the night. He dismounted before the front entrance, his clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his head, rain streaming down his face, and approached the door with the intention of demanding immediate entry, but the butler who answered his knock was implacable in his refusal. "Her ladyship is not receiving visitors, Your Grace," the man said with a careful neutrality that could not quite hide his disapproval, "particularly not at this hour, and most particularly not you. Tell Lady Beatrice that Sebastian Whitmore begs an audience," Sebastian said, his voice hoarse from the ride and the rain. "Tell her I will wait until she grants it." The butler's expression did not change. "Her ladyship has given explicit instructions that you are not to be admitted under any circumstances," he replied. "I must ask you to leave the premises, Your Grace." "Then I will wait here," Sebastian said, and turned away from the door to take up a position in the square across from Fairfax House, in the small park at its centre, where on fine days nurses brought their charges to play, and on evenings couples strolled beneath the trees. The butler watched him for a moment as if uncertain whether to summon constables or simply close the door, then chose the latter, leaving Sebastian standing alone in the rain-soaked square, his face turned upward toward the third-floor window, where a faint light burned behind curtains. Beatrice's window he knew from the architectural drawings he had studied when planning what was to have been their shared life. The rain fell with relentless intensity, soaking through what remained of his defenses until he was shivering violently, his formal clothes plastered to his body, his boots sinking into mud that had once been manicured lawn. But he did not move, did not seek shelter, simply stood looking up at that distant window, like a penitent before a shrine. A few late-night passers-by hurried through the square with heads down against the weather, casting curious glances at the lone figure standing motionless in the storm. But Sebastian did not acknowledge them, his entire focus fixed on that third-floor window where he knew Beatrice must be, where he hoped, against hope, that she might look out and see him, might grant him the audience he so desperately needed to beg her forgiveness for the unforgivable wrong he had done her. Inside Fairfax House, Beatrice sat by her window in darkness, unable to sleep as she had been unable to sleep properly since Westminster, her mind turning over and over the revelations Thomas had brought, the knowledge that her ruin had been engineered by manipulation, and her betrothed's failure to trust her enough to ask for the truth. She had been sitting thus for hours, staring out at the rain-swept square without really seeing it, when movement below caught her attention, and she focused on the figure standing in the small park across from her house. A man alone in the storm, motionless despite the weather, his face turned upward toward her window. Recognition came slowly, disbelief warring with certainty, but there was no mistaking that tall form, those broad shoulders, the aristocratic bearing that remained evident, even soaked and shivering in the rain. Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, was standing in Grosvenor Square in the middle of the night in a torrential rainstorm, looking up at her window as though all the answers in the world might be found there. Beatrice felt a confusing mixture of emotions surge through her, vindication that he had come to her, anger that he dared to come after what he had done, and beneath both of those, an unwanted concern for his well-being as she watched him shiver in the cold rain. She did not move from her window, did not light a candle or give any sign that she had seen him, simply sat in the darkness watching the man who had destroyed her stand in the rain as though such suffering could somehow atone for the suffering he had caused. And as the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, as midnight gave way to the small hours of morning, and still Sebastian remained motionless in his vigil, Beatrice found herself wondering what could possibly have brought him to such desperate penance, and whether anything he might say could ever repair the damage his suspicion and pride had wrought. Sebastian Whitmore stood in the rain through that first endless night, through the grey dawn that brought no relief from the downpour, through the second day that unfolded with agonizing slowness, while London slowly became aware that something extraordinary was happening in Grosvenor Square. He did not move from his position in the small park across from Fairfax House, did not seek food or water or shelter, did not even shift his weight to ease the growing ache in his legs and back, simply stood with his face turned upward toward that third-floor window where occasionally the curtains twitched and he knew Beatrice was watching, though she gave no other sign of acknowledgement. The rain fell with varying intensity through those first hours, sometimes a heavy downpour that obscured vision and turned the world into a grey wall of water, sometimes lighter drizzle that was almost worse in its persistence, soaking through every layer of clothing until Sebastian's formal attire hung from his frame like weights and his boots sank deeper into mud that had once been manicured lawn. By mid-morning of the first day, servants from the neighbouring houses had begun to notice the peculiar sight of a gentleman standing motionless in the square despite the weather, and word spread through the interconnected network of household staff with the speed that only gossip can achieve leaping from kitchen to drawing room to street, until within hours half of fashionable London knew that the Duke of Ashford was maintaining some sort of vigil outside Fairfax House. Curious onlookers began to gather, at first in small numbers, servants sent to confirm the wild rumours, then members of society themselves who could not resist witnessing such an unprecedented spectacle. And by afternoon of that first day, Grosvenor Square had taken on an almost carnival atmosphere, vendors appearing with hot chestnuts and meat pies to sell to the growing crowd, ladies and gentlemen arriving in carriages to stare at the Duke, as though he were an attraction at a fair. The newspapers got wind of the story by evening and sent sketch artists to capture the scene, young men with charcoal and paper who positioned themselves to render the image of the tall aristocratic figure standing alone in the rain, his formal clothes soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his head, his face turned always toward that third-floor window with an expression of such desperate hope that even the most cynical observers felt something stir in their chests. Sebastian was aware of the gathering crowd in a distant way, could hear the whispers and speculation that surrounded him, could see from the corner of his eye the sketch artists working and the vendors hawking their wares. But none of it mattered. None of it penetrated the singular focus he maintained on Beatrice's window, on the faint glow of candlelight behind the curtains, on the hope that perhaps if he stood here long enough, suffered enough, demonstrated clearly enough the depth of his remorse, she might grant him the audience he so desperately needed to beg her forgiveness. His body began to rebel against the punishment he was inflicting upon it as the first day wore into evening, and then night. Shivering that started as occasional tremors became constant, violent shaking, his lips taking on a blue tinge that was visible even in the dim light of the gas lamps that ringed the square, his breathing growing labored and painful in his chest. But he did not move, did not acknowledge his physical distress any more than he acknowledged the crowd that watched his suffering with varying degrees of sympathy and scandal. Inside Fairfax House, Beatrice had not left her position by the window since she first spotted Sebastian in the square, had pulled a chair close to the glass and sat there hour after hour, watching the man who had destroyed her stand in the rain as though such penance could somehow atone for his sins. Her maid brought tea that grew cold untouched, urged her to eat something, to rest, to at least move away from the window. But Beatrice could not, found herself as fixed in her vigil as Sebastian was in his, watching him shiver and sway with exhaustion, while fury warred with an unwanted compassion she despised herself for feeling. "Damn you, Sebastian," she whispered to her reflection in the rain-streaked glass. "Damn you for this melodrama, for turning my ruin into a public spectacle, for standing there as though your suffering could somehow erase what you did to me." Yet even as the words left her lips, she could not look away, could not stop cataloguing the signs of his deterioration, the way his shoulders had begun to slump forward, the trembling that was now visible even from her third-floor vantage, the blue tinge spreading from his lips across his face. Lady Henrietta appeared at the door of Beatrice's room multiple times through that first day and night.